wearing these when I wrote it.
Yeah.
Because I can't begin without thanking you in person. I never dreamed that I would be here so soon, after, here in the pulpit so soon. It was a joy to be back with you last month. I managed to attend 5 churches in 4 Sundays. And today I get to double up. I'm going to get back to 1 for, since I went to 2 today, my average is going to go back to 1 for 1. I'm so grateful that I was free to help out because I love Beverly. I love this charge because of Beverly, Denise, and I'm sure your other beloved new fella. He's sweet as can be, and I'm glad I got to meet him last month. But what I wrote was, what a joy to return to you all last month. You've been such a gift of faith, love, and support to Jeff and me. God at work in a mighty way. Our family and I are especially grateful you donated to Park Center. Actually, in recent years, not only my daughter-in-law, who's been a social worker with people who are mentally ill and in need of housing, she's been with that nonprofit ministry for more than 15 years. Our son joined them over the pandemic after working with people in need of health care who are homeless. He now does development to help make sure that housing is being created in Nashville that people can afford, especially working with people who are in recovery and need supportive housing, but that's affordable while they get established in recovering from drugs and alcohol addiction. And my dad would be so proud of him in that. So Park Center is dear to, it's like another church to our family, because we're part of several churches and we couldn't pick just one. And I'm not going to go around saying just one of y'all is my favorite. But our family and I are especially grateful you donated to Park Center in Jeff's honor. And it has been that more than $4,000 has been given in his memory. As it supports folks with mental illness at risk for being homeless. They are close to the heart of the gospel, and we love you all. And then I had a PS to Jill and Charlie, and that was just plain trash talk.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. Howard, thank you for the music this morning at the piano. And when I sat at the piano myself this morning, I played Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. And it's so perfect for this day, which is called Christ the King in the Christian year. And as a little girl, one of my very favorite hymns was Beneath the Cross of Jesus, 297, which is a perfect hymn for today. The Lord must have inspired us together, because here's the text that I chose in light of it being Christ the King Sunday. And if you could imagine one symbol that you may or may not have seen in Christian churches. We happen to live in Nashville across from a church called Christ the King, big Catholic church. And I've been inside a number of times for a lot of all holy reasons. But one of the ways in which their name is visually displayed is the picture of Jesus, the sculpture, if you will, hanging above the altar. And it's clearly the crucified Jesus. And from the ceiling, the very high ceiling, is a beautiful, elaborate crown hanging, suspended above the head of the human and suffering Jesus. So imagine for a moment that to be a follower of Jesus brings together those two incredibly different symbols, the cross and the crown. And many times you'll see a shorthand of that symbol. It's a cross like we Protestants typically have, which is nice and clean and shiny, no suffering in sight. But atop that cross is a crown, holding those two things together. So hear these words from the crucifixion of Jesus, the Good Friday of our faith. Luke 23, I'm reading from today's English version. I'm beginning at verse 32. Can you hear me? Today's the first time I've done any preaching in over a year. So I'm not as, I'll find my legs and you all will laugh with me about it. I'm not even gonna open this, Charlie.
It's all, I broke the seal, so.
I could spill it no matter how you.
Okay.
I'll always remember my first time here, spilling water all over the pulpit. So at verse 32, we pick up in the narrative, and this translation goes like this. 2 other men, both of them criminals, were also led out to be put to death with Jesus. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there and the 2 criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, and he was speaking to those who had carried out the crucifixion, when he said these words, "Forgive them, Father, they don't know what they are doing." They divided his clothes among themselves by throwing dice. The people stood there watching while the Jewish leaders made fun of them. Not all the Jewish leaders, but the ones who had sought to extinguish this person who they believed was wrongly claiming to be the King of the Jews, the Messiah. He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah whom God has chosen. The soldiers also made fun of him. They came up to him and offered him cheap wine and said, "Save yourself if you are the king of the Jews." Again, listen how many ways the kingship is in dispute. It's at the very heart of the motivations for those who brought Jesus to one of the most shameful forms of execution and death, public humiliation and degradation. Above Jesus were written these words, "This is the King of the Jews." Ridicule, ridicule. One of the criminals on one side, hanging there, hurled insults at Jesus. He joined, in effect, with those who had put Jesus to death. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other one, however, rebuked him, saying, "Don't you fear God? You received the same sentence that he did. Ours, however, is only right, because we are getting what we deserve for what we did, but he has done no wrong." And he said to Jesus, "Remember me, Jesus, when you come as king." When you come as king. And Jesus said to him, "I promise you that today you will be in paradise with me." The word of God for the people of God.
Thank you be to God.
Who's really our king? Who's really our queen? Who is the real sovereign in our lives? We spend a lot of our time, from the time we're 2, trying to figure out who's in charge, right? It's often been said that being 2 years old is real close to being a teenager, because a lot of that developmental stage is testing and checking and kind of sounding the waters and trying to figure out who's in charge. And some of us, when we figure that out, like a lot of eldest children, I'm an eldest child, and I've been talking a lot to Lynn Simpson Shores, and I'm pretty sure Lynn is even more of this kind of eldest child. You can quote me to her later. I've already said this to her. I said, "Lynn, you and I were the kind of eldest children who might as well have been called deputy parents. Because we figured out who was in charge and we got ourselves hooked up to their authority. And if our parents said, 'Lynn, get Diane and Beth and Annette back in order,' well, Lynn could do it. And I know that my mom, on many occasions, counted on me to try to keep my sister and brother in line. Was it the right thing to do? I don't know, but we can grow up and we can attach authority to many human beings. Kings and queens, any of you watch a lot of the things about Queen Elizabeth? I think the reason Americans like Queen Elizabeth so much is she wasn't our queen. We could just enjoy her. And as with Princess Diana, whom Americans loved, and many, many good reasons for that. She was kind of like Cinderella or Snow White or, you know, some of the queens that Disney has made so familiar to little girls. All looks like a fairy tale, unless you watch a lot of TV. Who is the authority in your life and in my life? Now, there are many really trustworthy human authorities, and I'm not here today to go over that with you. I'm really asking each of us to ask ourselves today, who's in charge? And I remember many, many times my dad, who had a different approach to deputizing me, he wanted to train me to do a lot of things he wasn't sure my mother could do. One of which was, not only did he teach me to drive when I was 10, and of course you do that on real roads, and it was usually at the end of a home call where I would drive all the way in from wherever in the county, and even Stewart County, wherever we'd gone for the home call, and I'd waited faithfully in the car. I was tall enough I could reach the button that dimmed the lights. I wasn't just tall enough to see over the steering wheel, because I was tall for my age. But you have to remember the dimmers. So I learned to dim lights because I drove for at least a year on occasions like this and had never driven in the daytime. The idea was that I was a deputy driver in the family, and when I was 15, before I got my full license, he had me driving in the snow because he said, your mom is a nervous driver, and somebody in the family needs to drive in the snow if I'm not right there. He wanted me to learn lots of things so that I could be as independent as possible, so that I wouldn't have to rely on somebody who wasn't reliable. And I'll always be thankful that he wanted me to put some of the authority for my life right here inside of me. And I can remember how many times, many, many times, he said, Diane, you're in charge. In other words, only you can decide who or what needs to be done or who needs to be revered. He gave me a great sense of my own independence, but more than that, a responsibility to look for the leaders who are trustworthy that I would follow. Now, one of the gifts of my family journey is that I knew without a doubt, for both my parents and much of my extended family, there was a very, very strong allegiance to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. And the ultimate leader that any of us could look to, especially if we took time to study the Bible, and even better if we got to study the good people that we grew up knowing in our churches, in our community. We could follow those leaders because they were following the real leader. How do we follow a leader who dies as an executed criminal on the cross? It seems contradictory, doesn't it? The suffering that we see of Jesus is there. It's given to us from the eyewitnesses who on the earth followed him all the way to the cross. And not all of the Jewish leaders were opposed to Jesus. People like Nicodemus was part of the very council that worked at putting him to death. And Nicodemus was a secret follower who later became a public follower, according to the Gospel of John. There were disciples who went into hiding. They weren't there. But we're told there were witnesses and people who followed Jesus who were there and who must have been within earshot of what was happening at the scene of Jesus' crucifixion. They saw the ridicule. They saw what seems like a torturous taunting. And they saw the behavior of these two different criminals on one side and the other. Okay, I'm going to tell you two different things about my husband. One of which is that he, and for years, was friends with Charlie Strobel in Nashville, who started something called Room in the Inn, which allows churches and synagogues, but mostly churches all over Middle Tennessee, to bring in people during the cold nights so they don't freeze to death. And they get a hot meal, they get breakfast, and a sack lunch. Charlie was a priest of a congregation before he began to head this ministry and grow it to serve thousands. Jeff was raised in a Roman Catholic church. I'm not sure how much snow they have, Gail, but they bound to have a whole lot. Livingston County is his hometown area, and they're a little further away from Buffalo, but in his hometown, there were 2 Catholic churches. That's so small a town, but there were enough Catholics to go around for 2. They separated out the Irish from the German. He was with the German group, who had the nicest, fanciest church, which of course, once I got to go to family reunions, I knew what I'd seen in other Catholic settings, and that is that children being taken to church in a Catholic church are going to grow up. From the time they can open their eyes and look around, they're going to see usually a sculpture or artwork over the altar of a Jesus who is in the extremity of suffering on the cross. I think I can probably imagine my parents saying, that's just so gruesome. Why would you put that in church? But for a Catholic, it's just normal. You're used to seeing the cross with the suffering Christ still on the cross. And Jeff and Charlie Strobel would talk about their Catholic backgrounds and say that it may have actually been a help to both of them to find their ministries with people in trouble, people suffering various ways, because they both grew up understanding that God was in that man in the extremity of suffering on the cross, and that anyone they saw in the world might indeed embody the spirit that God asked us to recognize, the living Spirit of God in all of us, and especially perhaps when we are suffering. That's the last place where the living Spirit of God should be extinguished. And in Jesus, that Spirit is alive and well. He's giving the grace of forgiveness to those who have perpetrated what we think of as a terrible crime of putting our Lord to death. And he's not finished giving grace, is he? We all have a choice. So my second story about Jeff, it's a little sacrilegious. Those of you on Facebook, put on your seatbelts. If you went to the service we had for Jeff, one of our closest friends was able to quote Jeff in conversing with an inmate. And it was a very typical conversation, and much of what our friend said was blank, blankety, blank, 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 blank. And we could hear our friend. He was honest to Jeff's cadence of speech. And we knew exactly what Jeff must have said. And our friend, in finishing the quote, would say, well, Jeff, why did you say it that way? And he said, Bob, you just have to speak in a language that people will understand. Now, I never heard him use that language in church. And for the most part, except for close clergy friends, I don't think he said it to church people. But he knew and believed that clergy ought to be able to stand whatever, including me. So he is blessed with an incredible friendship in a congregation I served almost 30 years ago. And the grace of this friendship was this fella and his family, who had been founders of their church, was a scoutmaster with the Boy Scout troop, the perfect age for both of our boys. And my husband loved scouting. He became an assistant scoutmaster. Both of our boys became Eagle Scouts. They know it was a formative life experience because this good man, who was a church leader and very devoted church and community leader, was their scoutmaster who loved them dearly. and showed them how to grow up as young men, even with the things that 2-year-olds and teenagers are always going to be tempted to do. So this man and Jeff remained very close friends, and he's remained a good friend to our family, ironically, because at the time Jeff was diagnosed, unusually young to have Alzheimer's, this man's wife, same age as us, was also diagnosed. So even with the pandemic, he became, with me, a 2-person support group if I had to get on the phone, or if he needed to get on the phone. And truly, the Lord has blessed that friendship in ways that I will never forget. This summer, when we were actually free to catch a real in-person lunch together, and we knew that the end was coming for Jeff. And I've used this phrase, but I've never lived it so thoroughly as we did. And that is that we knew that Jeff's Good Friday had begun. And it lasted over a number of months. I thank God it didn't last more than a year. But the Good Friday was certainly around us, and we were beginning to imagine the ways we could celebrate Jeff's whole life after the physical journey of his life was over. And our friend said, oh, you need to tell, let me tell, or you need to tell the story of me and Jeff in Guatemala. Well, Jeff had gotten this friend involved in going on short-term mission, the kind that my dad loved so dearly. And they would be, I got to go to Honduras and Guatemala, and Donnie Mitchell, of all things, was already friends with Jeff before we figured out we'd both grown up in Erin together. The Lord working in mysterious ways, and actually Donnie Mitchell is one of the great trash talkers of all times. If you don't know that. Jeff is in Guatemala. They are working on, I think it was a school, because they had enough money to pay for teachers, but they couldn't build schools. And the teachers were holding class under trees. And our team worked on the same school several years in a row, continuing to add rooms and floors, and I'm thrilled one year we finally added bathrooms, because the baños before our new bathrooms came along, they needed real bathrooms. Every school does. Jeff gets back to the gathering place at the end of the day. They've had 10, 12 hours of pretty hard and sweaty labor. It's hot. And there happens to be a very cool concrete floor in the building where they're waiting before they eat their supper together. And Jeff just stretches all the way out on that concrete floor. Remember the cool concrete in the summer if you didn't have air conditioning? It might be cooler than any other part of the building or the room. And when he stretches out, he's dramatic. I'm not the only one. Our son makes a living being dramatic. Jeff dramatically rolls his eyes up and he turns to his friend Russell and said, Russell, don't I look like Jesus on the cross? And Russell says, no, you look like the guy on the other side. And of course, the question is, which one? Which one will we be? Which one will we be? We will probably not get to the end of our physical days blameless, innocent, never having committed a sin. I don't even know if we can get to our end of our life without committing a crime. I don't know hardly any Methodist preacher who hadn't been a speed demon. I got the encouragement to speed, not from my dad who taught me to drive, though he'd get caught every now and then, and thank goodness for Mr. Kirkendall. Oh, Dr. Layton, oh, go on. A lot of Methodist clergy are known for just driving like we're sure of where we'll go at the end. And yet, the risk of taking somebody with us who's not ready is a real crime. And we know that is even more true now, that more people are living on the earth. What, we crossed the 8 billion mark since I was with you last. Which one will we be? We're not blameless. We, in that way, are like each person on both sides. But every moment of our journey, we have the opportunity to decide who will be our Lord, who will be our King, Who will be our sovereign? Who will be the leader we follow? Who will be the one for whom we are blessed to be a deputy or a foreman? Where will we take our marching orders? And in this moment, as they all three are approaching death from a terrible form of execution, one of them on the cross rebukes the other one and says, we're innocent. This man is innocent. This man is innocent. And he asks Jesus to forgive him. And what does he say? Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he doesn't ask it as a question. He says, when you come into your kingdom. Jesus is the sovereign for this man in this moment. And for all of us, it's just a collection of moments, isn't it? In every moment, who is our sovereign? Jesus, remember me. When you come into your kingdom, you're my king. You're the crucified one. If I'm following you into your kingdom, I know it doesn't mean I will be spared all the experiences of being mortal, of being heir to all the things that can cause us to know that we'll never be perfect. We're not whole in the sense of being physically whole. I'll need these things more than I wish I had them. I mean, a lot of times I don't have them when I need them. I've just been reminded that I better start putting them on when I write. We have so many ways of discovering the limits of our human ability, so many ways to claim our human frailty, so many ways to know that in that very moment we can choose anger and shame, or we can choose to acknowledge I'm human and I follow a God who has become with us human in flesh, Jesus Christ, God incarnate. And that means that this king, this ruler, can see us through everything. Whether we're experiencing the Good Friday of the life of someone we love, as Beverly has experienced with Dave since you saw her last. Whether we are still in our own Good Friday, whether we're in a crisis that has been brought on by our own choices, or because of something we can't help, like 77 inches of snow. This is disastrous. This is not funny, is it? There's a sense in which we can get excited about helping people in hurricanes. We now know we may need to get really motivated to help those who are at the extremes of weather, like lake effect snow, in a time like this. Something never seen before. We are all likely to experience something that no one has quite ever seen before in quite the same way. But you know what? We are not afraid. We are not held captive by our fear. We are given the love of one whose love casts out all of our fear. And in casting out our fear, we are united with the deepest power within us, between us, and among us. And that's the power of God's love, which is at work even more where we, as Paul would say, where I am weak, there I am strong, because the grace of God is even more fully able to flow. I don't have any pretensions about whether I'm in charge or not. I know that there's someone I can trust, and that one will be in charge from now until eternity. And in that one, we have a monarch, a sovereign, a king that will be indeed with us forever. I pray the Lord's Prayer. Jeff and I were praying it together out loud every day. In the late years of his life, he joined me in a form of prayer that's really about, it's called centering prayer, but it's really just meditation where you get as quiet as you can be for the purpose of letting God speak and being open enough that you or I might be able to receive what God is leading us or telling us. And we would do this with a group. We actually met at Christ the King Catholic Church. Only 3 or 4 of the group went to the church. Others came from all different churches. And at the end of every one of these 20 or 30 minutes of meditation and listening, we would pray the Lord's Prayer. And it was an amazing comfort to do this with Jeff every day, even though our group could no longer meet because of the pandemic. In fact, I never imagined that we would have so much time on our hands that every morning we look forward to this part of our routine. At the end of this prayer time, we prayed the Lord's Prayer. And I prayed it with him as I would pray it with you. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This summer, when he couldn't join me in this kind of prayer time, and I really felt like it was me and God, I began to pray on my own with a new way, which was, thy kingdom come, thy will be done in me as in heaven. And when I'm in community, on earth means all of us. But I know that the on earth also has to begin with me. So I offer that to you if you're alone and you're praying. You may pray as the prayer prays. Our. It's a community prayer. But if you need also to go through your own journey, what could be your own Good Friday, thy will be done in me, as in heaven. And there's a deep sense in which we know that God's love and sovereignty continues to begin in that place where I yield to the real person, entity in charge. I'm so grateful I've known that divine presence of Jesus the Christ. So many things I've preached over the years. You know, when you're a young preacher, you preach about things that you're not sure about. You preach about things you've never seen that people have to go through, or that you're not sure how to accompany them, and you do your best. You do it hopefully in love and in trust, knowing that it's God who does all the real work between us and among us. But I can share with you today, and I know this with a depth of truth that I never do until now, that everything over the years that I've preached about worked. It came true. It bore fruit for me and for Jeff and our family. And it allowed us to continue making new friends when many of us would want to hide away. And let me say that for you and the churches of this charge, I don't know if I ever dreamed how meaningful it would become for Jeff to be with you, because he had to be with me. I've made him go to a lot of church over the years, but these several years where we've had the chance to share with you as a couple will have been one of the greatest gifts of my whole life. And whether you can read my words or not, they're true. Would you pray with me? God, in all the ways that you need to come alongside us, we welcome you. We'll try not to be like a 2-year-old or an angry teenager like the guy on one side of Jesus. We know we have days like that. But let our life largely take on the openness and the faith of the one on the other side, who said with us, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And let us know that we will never be alone for all of eternity by your grace and your love. Amen. Our hymn is number 370.